Sophie Martinez was excited about her first day at Sunshine Nursery. Her mother, Maria, had spent weeks preparing her for this big change. They had bought a new pink backpack with butterflies on it, shiny shoes that lit up when she walked, and the prettiest dress Sophie had ever seen. The 4-year-old couldn't stop smiling as she walked through the nursery's bright yellow doors that September morning. The first week went by smoothly. Sophie made new friends, especially a kind boy named Tommy who shared his crayons with her. She loved the colorful classroom with its alphabet charts and animal pictures on the walls. The assistant teachers were nice, always ready with a gentle smile or a helping hand. But then Miss Thompson, the lead teacher, returned from her vacation. Miss Thompson looked like a normal teacher. She wore flowery dresses and had gray hair tied neatly in a bun. When parents were around, she smiled and spoke softly. But Sophie noticed something different in Miss Thompson's eyes when she looked at her. They weren't warm like her mother's eyes or friendly like Tommy's. They were cold, like the ice cubes in her juice box at lunchtime. It started with small things. When Sophie raised her hand to answer questions during circle time, Miss Thompson would ignore her. If Sophie's crayon went slightly outside the lines while coloring, Miss Thompson would hold up her work in front of everyone. "Look, children," she would say in a sharp voice, "this is not how we color. Sophie needs to try harder." The other children would look down at their own papers, feeling uncomfortable. During snack time, Miss Thompson always served Sophie last. Sometimes she would say there weren't enough cookies left, even though Sophie could see them in the box. At nap time, Sophie's mat was placed far from the other children, next to the noisy air conditioner that made scary sounds. When Sophie couldn't sleep because of the noise, Miss Thompson would write notes to her mother saying Sophie was disruptive during rest period. The changes in Sophie happened slowly. First, she stopped talking about her day at school. When Maria asked her what she learned, Sophie would just shrug her tiny shoulders and look at her shoes. Then she started having trouble sleeping at night. She would wake up crying, clutching her favorite teddy bear, Mr. Snuggles. One morning, 3 months after starting nursery, Sophie stood in front of the bathroom mirror, her bottom lip trembling as she tried to button her dress. "I can't do anything right," she whispered to herself, repeating the words Miss Thompson often said to her. Maria, who was walking past the bathroom, stopped when she heard this. Her heart felt heavy, but she didn't know why her usually happy daughter was saying such sad things. The breaking point came when Sophie started crying every morning before school. She would hold on to her mother's leg, begging not to go. "My tummy hurts," she would say, or "I'm too tired." Maria took her to the doctor, but they couldn't find anything wrong. The doctor suggested it might be anxiety, but what could a 4-year-old be anxious about? At school, Tommy watched all of this happen to his friend. He saw how Sophie's bright smile had disappeared. He noticed how she sat alone during playtime, even when he invited her to join the games. Sometimes during art class, you would see tears falling on Sophie's drawings, making little wet spots on the paper. But whenever he asked if she was okay, Sophie would quickly wipe her eyes and say she was fine. Miss Thompson was clever. When other teachers or parents were around, she acted differently towards Sophie. She would pat Sophie's head and use a sweet voice, but as soon as they left, the cold eyes would return. She knew exactly when the assistant teachers went on their breaks and when the director was busy in her office. Sophie felt trapped in a world where no one could see her pain. Every day, she carried her butterfly backpack into the nursery, each step feeling heavier than the last. She didn't know that soon everything would change, thanks to a brave friend who refused to stay silent about what he saw. Tommy Anderson was different from the other 5-year-olds at Sunshine Nursery. While other children were busy playing with toys or chasing each other around the playground, Tommy paid attention to everything happening around him. His parents always said he had old eyes and a young face. These observant eyes now watched his friend Sophie with growing worry. On this particular Monday morning, Tommy sat at the blue table during art time, carefully drawing his family. But his eyes kept moving to where Sophie sat alone at the yellow table. Miss Thompson had separated her from the group again, claiming Sophie was too disruptive. Tommy knew this wasn't true. Sophie was one of the quietest children in class. As he watched, Miss Thompson walked past Sophie's table. "Your drawing looks like scribbles," she said loudly, making some children giggle. Even the 3-year-olds in the other class do better than this. Tommy saw Sophie's small hands start to shake, and she accidentally knocked over her cup of water. Instead of helping her clean up like the teachers usually did, Miss Thompson made Sophie sit in the wet chair for the rest of art time. During snack time, Tommy saved half of his cookies in his pocket. He had noticed that Miss Thompson often ran out of snacks before reaching Sophie. When the other children were busy eating, Tommy quietly walked to Sophie's table and slipped the cookies onto her napkin. Sophie gave him a small smile, the first one he had seen from her in days. Later that afternoon, during story time, something happened that made Tommy's stomach feel sick. Miss Thompson was reading a book about a brave princess, and she asked the class questions about the story. Sophie raised her hand to answer, just like she used to do before Miss Thompson started being mean to her. To everyone's surprise, Miss Thompson called on her. The princess used her magic sword to save the kingdom. Sophie said in a soft voice, she was right, that's exactly what happened in the story. But Miss Thompson shook her head and laughed. Wrong again, Sophie. You really need to pay better attention. This is why you sit alone. You can't even follow a simple story. Tommy saw tears forming in Sophie's eyes. He knew she had given the right answer. He looked around at the other children, but they all stared at their shoes or the carpet, too scared to say anything. The assistant teacher, Miss Jenny, wasn't in the room. She was on her lunch break, just like she was every day at this time. That's when Tommy remembered something important. Last week, his parents had taken him to a safety fair at the local police station. Officer Sarah had taught the children about calling 911 in emergencies. If someone is getting hurt, she had said, or if you see something really wrong happening, you should call 911. The police will come to help. Tommy thought hard about what Officer Sarah had said. Was this an emergency? He watched as Miss Thompson made Sophie sit facing the wall during free playtime, saying she needed to think about her behavior. You saw Sophie's shoulders shaking as she cried silently. You remembered how Sophie used to laugh and play, how she would share her stickers and help other kids with their shoelaces. Now she barely spoke or smiled. Yes, Tommy decided this was an emergency. His friend was getting hurt. Not with pushes or hits, but with mean words and cruel actions. He had tried telling the assistant teachers, but they'd always seemed too busy or scared to do anything about Miss Thompson. Even when he told his own mother about the mean things he saw, she said adults sometimes had different ways of teaching. But Tommy knew in his heart that this wasn't teaching. It was wrong. As he watched Sophie wipe away more tears, he made an important decision. Tomorrow, during outdoor playtime when Miss Thompson was busy watching the playground, he would sneak back inside to use the office phone. His parents had made him memorize those 3 important numbers, 9 to 11. Tommy felt scared thinking about what he was going to do, but when he looked at Sophie sitting alone by the wall, he knew he had to be brave. Sometimes he remembered his dad saying, doing the right thing was scary, but that's what made it brave. Tuesday morning arrived with dark clouds hanging over Sunshine Nursery. The weather matched the gloomy atmosphere inside Miss Thompson's classroom, where Sophie sat alone at her usual spot near the window. The raindrops racing down the glass reminded her of the tears she tried so hard to hold back every day. Miss Thompson seemed especially angry this morning. Maybe it was because of the rain, or perhaps because the nursery's director had praised Sophie's painting during her brief visit yesterday. Whatever the reason, she watched Sophie like a hawk watching its prey, waiting for any small mistake. During morning circle time, the children sat on colorful cushions, learning about different animals. Miss Thompson held up pictures, asking the class to name each one. When she showed a picture of a giraffe, several children raised their hands, including Sophie. This time, Miss Thompson called on her with a strange smile that didn't reach her eyes. It's a giraffe. Sophie answered correctly, her voice barely above a whisper. Instead of acknowledging the right answer, Miss Thompson's smile turned into a frown. Speak up, Sophie. No one can hear your mumbling. Stand up and tell the whole class again. Sophie's legs shook as she stood, her eyes filling with tears. Before she could speak, Miss Thompson cut in. Never mind. Sit down. This is why you'll never learn anything. You can't even follow simple instructions. Miss Jenny, the assistant teacher, watched this exchange with concern from the back of the room. She had noticed Miss Thompson's treatment of Sophie getting worse over the past weeks. Several times, she had tried to talk to the nursery director, but Miss Thompson always had an explanation ready. Sophie was developmentally behind. She needed extra discipline or was seeking attention. Miss Jenny felt helpless, especially since Miss Thompson had worked at the nursery for 15 years and was friends with many important people in town. By lunchtime, Sophie's day had gotten even worse. While the children enjoyed their sandwiches and juice boxes, Sophie accidentally spilled a few drops of water on her table. Miss Thompson's reaction was immediate and severe. "That's it," she announced loudly. "Sophie, you're making too much mess. Take your lunch to the supply closet. Maybe eating alone will teach you to be more careful." Tommy watched in horror as Miss Thompson led Sophie to the small supply closet near the bathroom. The closet was dark and filled with cleaning supplies and old toys. It had a tiny window near the ceiling that let in just enough light to make scary shadows on the walls. Miss Thompson placed Sophie's lunchbox on a low shelf and closed the door, leaving it slightly open as required by school rules. From his seat, Tommy could hear Sophie's quiet sobs coming from the closet. Other children at his table whispered nervously to each other, but no one dared to speak up. Even the usual chatter of lunchtime seemed muted, as if the whole classroom knew something very wrong was happening. Miss Jenny returned from her lunch break to find Sophie missing from the lunch tables. When she asked where Sophie was, Miss Thompson casually mentioned she was taking a quiet lunch break in the supply closet. Miss Jenny's face showed her shock, but before she could say anything, Miss Thompson reminded her that she was just a temporary assistant and should focus on cleaning up the lunch tables. The afternoon dragged on endlessly. During craft time, Sophie's hands trembled so much she couldn't cut straight lines for her paper butterfly. Miss Thompson displayed Sophie's crooked butterfly on the board, using it as an example of what not to do. Some children giggled nervously, while others, like Tommy, felt their hearts ache for their friend. As the day neared its end, Sophie sat alone during free playtime, her usually bright eyes now dull and red from crying. She hugged her knees to her chest, watching other children play with toys and games she wasn't allowed to touch. Tommy tried to share his blocks with her, but Miss Thompson quickly sent him away, saying Sophie needed to learn to play by herself. What no one knew was that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, Tommy would put his plan into action, and Sophie's nightmare at Sunshine Nursery would finally come to an end. Wednesday morning arrived with Tommy's heart beating faster than usual. He had gone over his plan many times in his mind last night, even practicing pressing the numbers 9 to 11 on his toy phone. His mother had noticed him being quieter at breakfast and asked if something was wrong. Tommy just shook his head and hugged her extra tight before leaving for nursery. As soon as Tommy entered the classroom, he looked for Sophie. She was already there, sitting in her usual corner, wearing a blue dress with tiny white flowers. Her eyes were focused on the floor, and she was holding her backpack like it was a shield. Tommy wanted to tell her that things would get better soon, but he knew he had to keep his plan a secret. Miss Thompson started the morning by checking everyone's homework folders. When she reached Sophie's desk, she pulled out Sophie's worksheet with an exaggerated frown. "Oh dear," she said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. Sophie colored the numbers all wrong again. Red was for even numbers, blue for odd numbers. "Can't you follow simple instructions?" Tommy watched as Sophie's lower lip trembled. He knew Sophie had done the worksheet correctly. He had seen her working on it yesterday, carefully following the rules. Miss Thompson was lying, but who would believe a child over a teacher? Tommy felt his hands getting sweaty as he thought about what he was going to do later. During morning lessons, Miss Thompson seemed particularly mean. She made Sophie stand in front of the class to recite the days of the week, then laughed when Sophie's voice shook so much she couldn't finish. "See, children," Miss Thompson said with a cruel smile, "this is what happens when you don't practice at home. Sophie's parents must be very disappointed." Tommy noticed Miss Jenny, the assistant teacher, looking uncomfortable, but as usual, she said nothing. He had overheard Miss Thompson telling Miss Jenny yesterday that she could easily be replaced if she couldn't handle the way things were done here. Miss Jenny needed this job to pay for her college classes, so she stayed quiet. Finally, it was time for outdoor play. Tommy waited by the classroom door, watching as Miss Thompson led the children outside. She always stayed on the playground, walking around with her clipboard and writing notes about the children's behavior. This was Tommy's chance. "Miss Thompson," he said politely, "may I use the bathroom?" She barely looked at him as she nodded, focused on writing something about Sophie, who was sitting alone on a bench instead of playing. Tommy walked quickly to the bathroom, but instead of going in, he looked both ways in the empty hallway and headed toward the office. The office door was open, and Tommy could see Mrs. Garcia, the secretary, getting ready to go to lunch. She always ate lunch at this time. Tommy had noticed this during his 3 weeks of planning. As soon as Mrs. Garcia left, Tommy slipped into the office. His heart was pounding so hard he thought everyone might hear it. The phone sat on Mrs. Garcia's desk. Tommy had to stand on his tiptoes to reach it. His hands were shaking as he remembered what Officer Sarah had said at the safety fair. When you call 911, stay calm and tell them what's wrong. He took a deep breath and pressed the numbers just like he had practiced. The phone made 3 beeping sounds as he pressed 911. Then there was a ringing noise. Tommy's mouth felt dry. What if they didn't believe him? What if he got in trouble? But then he thought about Sophie crying in the supply closet yesterday, and he knew he had to be brave. 911. What's your emergency? A kind woman's voice answered. Tommy's voice came out small but clear. My friend Sophie is getting hurt at Sunshine Nursery. Not with hits, but with mean words and scary punishments. Miss Thompson makes her cry every day and locks her in the closet. Please help her. She's really scared. There was a pause on the other end. You're very brave for calling, the woman said gently. Can you tell me where Sunshine Nursery is? Tommy could hear children playing outside through the office window. He knew he didn't have much time before someone came looking for him. It's on Green Street, next to the big supermarket, he said quickly. Please hurry. I have to go back outside now or Miss Thompson will be mad. Tommy had just made it back to the playground when he heard sirens in the distance. His heart started beating even faster as he watched 2 police cars pull up in front of Sunshine Nursery, their red and blue lights flashing in the morning sun. Several children stopped playing to point at the cars, excited to see real police officers up close. Miss Thompson's face turned pale as she watched Officer Sarah and 3 other police officers walk through the nursery gates. Tommy recognized Officer Sarah from the safety fair and felt a little braver. She was wearing the same kind smile she had when she taught them about calling 911. Everyone, line up right now. Miss Thompson called out, her voice shaking slightly. We're going inside early today. She glanced nervously at the approaching officers, then at the children who were slowly forming a line. Sophie stood at the very back, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. Before Ms. Thompson could lead the children inside, Mrs. Rivera, the nursery director, came hurrying out with the police officers. Miss Thompson, Mrs. Rivera said firmly, please stay here with the officers. Miss Jenny will take the children inside. Her face looked very serious, nothing like her usual cheerful expression. Miss Jenny quickly gathered the children, but Officer Sarah gently stopped Tommy and Sophie before they could follow their classmates. Would you 2 mind talking with us for a few minutes? She asked kindly. Tommy nodded bravely, while Sophie held onto Miss Jenny's hand, unsure of what was happening. Inside Mrs. Rivera's office, Tommy told the officers everything he had seen. He talked about the mean words, the supply closet punishments, and how Miss Thompson treated Sophie differently from everyone else. Officer Sarah wrote everything down in her notebook, nodding encouragingly whenever Tommy's voice got shaky. Sophie sat quietly at first, but as Tommy spoke, she began to share her own stories. Her voice was soft, but the officers listened carefully to every word. She told them about eating lunch alone in the dark closet, about being called stupid in front of everyone, and about how scared she felt every morning when she had to come to school. While they were talking, more people arrived at the nursery. 2 ladies wearing badges that said Child Services came to speak with Sophie. They had gentle voices and brought a stuffed teddy bear for her to hold. Sophie hugged the bear tightly as she answered their questions. Parents started arriving too, having received urgent calls from Mrs. Rivera. Sophie's mother, Maria, rushed in with tears in her eyes. When she saw Sophie holding the teddy bear and talking to the Child Services ladies, she ran to hug her daughter. My amor, why didn't you tell me? She cried, holding Sophie close. Miss Thompson said nobody would believe me, Sophie whispered, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. She said I was a bad girl and deserved it. Maria held her daughter tighter, her tears falling into Sophie's hair. Tommy's parents arrived next. His mother gasped when she learned what had been happening and what Tommy had done. You called 911 all by yourself? She asked, looking both proud and worried. Tommy nodded, suddenly feeling uncertain. Was that okay? He asked in a small voice. Officer Sarah knelt down beside Tommy. What you did today was very brave, she said warmly. You saw your friend being hurt and you asked for help. That's exactly what we taught you to do at the safety fair. Tommy's father put a hand on his shoulder, and Tommy could see tears in his dad's eyes. In the hallway, they could hear Ms. Thompson's loud voice protesting as the officers spoke with her. "This is ridiculous," she was saying. "I'm a professional with 15 years of experience. You can't possibly believe a bunch of children over me." But the security cameras in the classroom had caught everything. Mrs. Rivera, looking shocked and angry, watched with the officers as they played back videos showing days of Ms. Thompson's cruel behavior. The footage showed everything Tommy had described and more. As the morning turned to afternoon, more officials arrived at Sunshine Nursery. Parents came and went, many looking upset as they learned what had been happening in Ms. Thompson's classroom. But in Mrs. Rivera's office, Sophie finally smiled as she sat between her mother and Tommy, feeling safe for the first time in months. The next few days at Sunshine Nursery were very different. Miss Thompson was gone, and a kind teacher named Ms. Roberts took over the classroom. Children who had been quiet for months started laughing again, and Sophie no longer had to sit alone during activities. But in Mrs. Rivera's office, serious conversations were taking place. Detective Lisa Chen sat at Mrs. Rivera's desk, watching hours of security camera footage. The cameras had been installed last year for safety, but nobody had checked them regularly. Now, they showed everything that had happened in Ms. Thompson's classroom. Detective Chen wrote in her notebook as she watched, her face growing more concerned with each video. "Look at this," she said to Officer Sarah, pointing at the screen. "Last Thursday, Ms. Thompson made Sophie sit in the supply closet for 45 minutes because she dropped a crayon. They watched as the video showed Sophie crying in the dark closet while other children had snack time. This isn't just being strict, this is abuse." Mrs. Rivera couldn't stop crying as she watched the videos. "I should have known," she kept saying. "The signs were there. Sophie's mother told me she was having nightmares. Other parents complained that their children didn't want to come to school. But Miss Thompson always had explanations, and I believed her." More parents came forward with stories. Tommy's friend Jack's mother remembered how her son had told her that Miss Thompson is really mean to Sophie. She had thought Jack was exaggerating. Another parent recalled seeing Sophie standing alone in the corner during pickup time, but Miss Thompson had said it was a timeout for bad behavior. Miss Jenny, the assistant teacher, finally felt brave enough to share everything she had seen. She told the investigators about how Miss Thompson would change completely when other adults were around, acting sweet and caring. But as soon as they left, she would go back to being cruel to Sophie. "I was afraid to speak up," Miss Jenny admitted, wiping tears from her eyes. "Miss Thompson told me I would lose my job if I complained. I needed this job to pay for my college classes, but I feel terrible that I didn't help Sophie sooner." The child services workers, Ms. Martinez and Ms. Thompson, no relation to the teacher, spent time talking to all the children in the class. They used special dolls and drawing activities to help the children feel comfortable sharing their experiences. Many children had stories about seeing Sophie being punished or hearing mean words said to her. "Sophie's not stupid," one little girl named Emily told them while hugging a doll. "She knows all her numbers and colors." But Miss Thompson always said she was wrong, even when she was right. Other children nodded in agreement, finally feeling safe enough to tell the truth. The investigation also found something surprising in Miss Thompson's desk. She kept a special notebook where she wrote mean things about Sophie every day. She made up stories about Sophie misbehaving and wrote false reports to Sophie's parents. Detective Chen put the notebook in a plastic bag for evidence, shaking her head sadly as she read through the pages. Sophie's parents met with lawyers who specialized in helping children. They learned that what Miss Thompson had done was against many laws. The lawyers explained that teachers are never allowed to lock children in closets or use mean words to make them feel bad about themselves. Sophie's father held his daughter's hand tightly as they listened, promising her that nothing like this would ever happen to her again. Tommy became a hero at Sunshine Nursery. Mrs. Rivera put up a new poster in the hallway about speaking up when something's wrong. The poster had a picture of a phone and the numbers 911, reminding children that it's okay to ask for help when they see someone being hurt. By the end of the week, the police had collected enough evidence to take action against Ms. Thompson. The security videos, the notebook, and statements from children, parents, and Miss Jenny told a clear story of what had really been happening in Room 4 of Sunshine Nursery. Now it was time for Miss Thompson to face the consequences of her actions. 2 weeks after Tommy's brave phone call, life at Sunshine Nursery had changed completely. The classroom that once felt like a scary place for Sophie was now bright and welcoming under Ms. Roberts' care. But for Sophie, healing would take more time than just a few weeks. Dr. Sarah Wilson's office was nothing like the nursery. It had soft blue walls, comfortable beanbags, and lots of toys. Sophie visited Dr. Wilson 3 times a week for special play therapy sessions. Dr. Wilson wasn't like other doctors. She didn't wear a white coat or use big words. Instead, she sat on the floor with Sophie and helped her talk about her feelings through games and drawing. "Can you show me how you feel today using these colors?" Dr. Wilson asked, placing crayons in front of Sophie. At first, Sophie only picked black and gray, drawing dark clouds and rain. But as the weeks passed, she started adding bits of yellow sunshine and blue sky to her pictures. Dr. Wilson smiled at each small sign of progress. At home, Sophie's parents made changes too. They moved her to a new nursery called Rainbow Kids, where the teachers had special training in helping children who had been through difficult experiences. Her new teacher, Ms. Linda, always asked before giving Sophie a hug and never made her sit alone, even when she was having a bad day. "You're safe here, Sophie," Ms. Linda would say gently when Sophie got scared during story time or worried about making mistakes. "Take all the time you need." Slowly, Sophie started raising her hand to answer questions again. Her voice, though still quiet, grew a little stronger each day. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, important things were happening. Miss Thompson had to face a judge and explain her actions. The security videos, her mean notebook, and the stories from children and parents showed everyone the truth. The judge looked very serious as he listened to all the evidence. "What you did was not teaching," the judge told Miss Thompson firmly. "It was bullying and abuse of a young child who trusted you." Miss Thompson lost her teaching license, meaning she could never work with children again. She also had to pay a fine and spend time in jail for hurting Sophie. The case made news all around town. Other nurseries and schools started checking their security cameras more often and training teachers about being kind to all children. Mrs. Rivera spoke at meetings with other school directors, sharing what she had learned from the terrible experience at Sunshine Nursery. "We must listen when children tell us something is wrong," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "And we must watch carefully for signs that a child is being hurt, even if we can't see bruises on the outside." Sophie's parents started a support group for other families whose children have been bullied by teachers. They met every Saturday in the local library, sharing stories and helping each other heal. Sophie would sometimes sit in these meetings, coloring quietly while listening to the grown-ups talk about making schools safer for everyone. Tommy's family was invited to a special ceremony at the police station. Officer Sarah presented him with a Young Hero certificate for being brave enough to call 911. Tommy's parents cried happy tears as they watched their son receive the award. But the best part for Tommy was seeing Sophie in the audience, actually smiling and clapping for him. "The scary things Miss Thompson did to you weren't your fault," Tommy told Sophie during the small party after the ceremony. They sat together eating cupcakes with blue frosting. "You were always smart and good. She was the one who was wrong." Sophie looked at her friend, her eyes clearer and brighter than they had been in months. "Thank you for being my friend," she said softly. "And thank you for making the mean things stop." Dr. Wilson said Sophie was making good progress in her healing journey. She still had nightmares sometimes, and loud noises could make her jump. But she was learning that it was okay to speak up, to make mistakes, and to ask for help when she needed it. Most importantly, she was learning to trust teachers again, one kind word at a time. 1 year had passed since the day Tommy made his brave phone call. The leaves were turning orange and red outside Rainbow Kids Nursery, where Sophie now spent her days filled with laughter and learning. On this special autumn morning, Sophie and Tommy were getting ready for an important presentation at their old nursery, Sunshine. Mrs. Rivera had invited them to speak to a group of new teachers about their experience. The nursery looked different now. The walls had been painted in cheerful colors, and new posters about kindness and speaking up against bullying hung everywhere. Most importantly, there were now windows in all classroom doors, and cameras were checked every day. Sophie wore her favorite purple dress with butterflies for the presentation. She wasn't the same scared little girl anymore. Now 5 years old, she stood taller and smiled more easily. Tommy, now 6, sat beside her in the front of the room, wearing a neat blue shirt that matched his young hero pin. Sophie and Tommy are here to help us understand why being kind is so important, Mrs. Rivera explained to the group of teachers sitting in small chairs. Their story changed not just our nursery, but many schools in our town. Tommy spoke first, his voice clear and confident. I saw my friend being hurt with mean words and scary punishments, he said. I learned from Officer Sarah that calling 911 isn't just for when someone is bleeding. It's for any time someone is being hurt, even if you can't see the hurt on the outside. When it was Sophie's turn to speak, she held Tommy's hand for courage. I used to think I was bad and stupid because Miss Thompson said so, she told the teachers. But now I know that wasn't true. Good teachers help you learn from mistakes. They don't make you feel scared or alone. The new teachers listened carefully, many wiping tears from their eyes. After the presentation, one young teacher raised her hand. How can we make sure children trust us? She asked. Sophie thought for a moment before answering. My new teacher, Ms. Linda, always says it's okay to take my time. She never makes me feel bad when I'm scared or when I make mistakes. She helps me feel safe. The presentation was such a success that other nurseries started asking Sophie and Tommy to share their story. They became known as the friendship heroes, showing other children that it's okay to speak up when something feels wrong. Their parents helped them make small cards with important phone numbers and messages like, "You are not alone," to give to other children. Dr. Wilson, who still saw Sophie once a month, said she was proud of how Sophie was using her experience to help others. Sometimes the best way to heal is to help other people, she explained. Sophie liked knowing that her story might help another child feel brave enough to speak up. Tommy and Sophie remained best friends, even though they now went to different schools. Every Saturday, their families met at the park where the children would play while their parents talked. Sometimes, other families from their support group would join them, turning the park into a place of healing and friendship. One sunny Saturday, as Sophie and Tommy sat on the swings, Sophie said something that made Tommy's heart feel warm. You know what, Tommy? I'm not afraid of tomorrow anymore. She pumped her legs, swinging higher. Miss Linda says everyone has bad days sometimes, but now I know that bad days don't last forever. Tommy smiled at his friend, remembering how far they had both come. And if bad days come, he said, we face them together. Their story became part of the training for new teachers all across the state. Schools started teaching children about the difference between strict teachers and mean ones, and about the importance of telling trusted adults when something feels wrong. The security cameras that had caught Ms. Thompson's cruel behavior were now used to help teachers become better at their jobs. As Sophie and Tommy grew older, they never forgot what they had learned. That one person's courage to speak up could change many lives, and that true friendship meant standing up for each other, no matter how scary it might be. Their story reminded everyone that heroes come in all sizes, and that kindness and bravery could make the world a better place, one classroom at a time.